This video would not be possible without War Thunder. More on them later. On October 21st, 2011, people across the world were confronted with the stark reality of how wars reach their conclusion. Conflict has always been a source of fascination, and television and media audiences are drawn, for one reason or another, to the darkest aspects of humanity. When these darker aspects involve the downfall of a tyrant, interest is all the greater. Films have been made of the final days of Hitler in his Berlin Führerbunker. Black and white images of Benito Mussolini hanging disfigured from the rafters of a petrol station in Milan are widely recognized. Grainy video from the trial of Ceausescu from Christmas Day 1989 exists, and while their summary execution was not captured, footage of their lifeless bodies lying moments later in a courtyard near Bucharest certainly was. Saddam Hussein's hanging in 2006 was also filmed, giving us partially obscured images of the Iraqi dictator's final moments, and then of his corpse dangling from its noose. We know how this stuff ends. And yet, we are distanced from it. We don't need to fully engage with its bloody truths. But on that day in 2011, the world caught up with war at the dawn of the media age. A video circulated widely and shown in redacted form via mainstream news outlets depicts events from the previous day. A man wounded, weak, clinging on to the last vestiges of life. He is dragged from a drainage culvert, surrounded by an angry mob who beat him, spit on him, and insult him. At various points, though struggling to speak, he says haram alaiko, translating as "this is a sin" or "God forbids it." The crowd are wreaking their vengeance upon him, and there's a sense of catharsis from them, even enjoyment. And the world is watching. But this is okay, the world tells itself, because this is not just any man. This man is Muammar Gaddafi. A man who was the enemy of the West for decades, the enemy of his own people perhaps. This was the man who harbored the Lockerbie bombers who killed 270 people when they blew up a Pan Am flight over Scotland in 1988. And the man linked to the murder of PC Yvonne Fletcher in London in 1984. At best, he was a cartoonish clown of a dictator who passed gas in television interviews and kept an ostentatious all-female bodyguard unit known as the Revolutionary Nuns. At worst, he was a ruthless war criminal accused of crimes against humanity. Who cares what happens to him? History is nuanced and layered, but even so, few people would defend many of Muammar Gaddafi's crimes. But this isn't really the point. The point is that on this October day, more than a decade gone by, the world was brought closer to the realities of brutal conflict. The death of a dictator wasn't something you read about or heard about or were shown images of anymore. It was something the world would witness with its own eyes. There was nothing new about the way in which Gaddafi died, but the manner in which the event reached the world certainly was new, and it signaled the beginning of a new age of media consumption. It might seem strange to think this now, looking back from 2024 or later, when most of us have seen at least one unimaginably horrifying video from Bakhmut, Donetsk, or Gaza, but this was a big deal in 2011. It might have been easy for some to file it away under "bad things happen to bad people," but this conclusion is less easy to apply in most cases. In most cases, bad things just happen, regardless of whether they were deserved, partially deserved, or not deserved at all. Let's take a step back from this watershed moment in conflict reporting and global consumption of war. October 20th, 2011 may have been the end of Gaddafi's story, or at least of his life, but it's just one moment in a bewildering and often sickening chain of events stretching back many decades. So, who was this man really? What was his role in Libya and on the world stage? Was he really as bad as Western media would suggest? And was what came next any better? And what brought this nation to revolution and to civil war? With the Middle East even more complex than it was in 2011, it's sometimes nice to take a break from the news and experience and learn about other periods and aspects of military history. That's why we love playing War Thunder, the sponsor of today's video. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made. Play for free on PC and on consoles and take command of over 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships. The vehicles in War Thunder span over 100 years of development, from the biplanes and armored cars of the 1920s all the way to the fighter jets and main battle tanks of today. Immerse yourself in intense combat where incredibly detailed vehicles, realistic graphics, and authentic sound effects place you right at the helm of the most powerful war machines of our time. Best part is that you don't need any fancy equipment to pilot or drive a tank. You can just use your mouse and keyboard. It's heavily optimized thanks to the in-house Daegor engine, delivering a lag-free experience with impressive visuals and high frame rates even on lower-end machines. We particularly enjoy War Thunder's sophisticated vehicle damage, which enhances realism, with every component intricately modeled and susceptible to enemy fire. A hit to the engine can disable you, and getting ammo racked means game over. It even shows you exactly what happened when your vehicle is destroyed with their X-ray view. Don't forget that War Thunder features a comprehensive customization system with countless camouflages, historical markings, and decorations for all types of vehicles, including community-created ones. Download War Thunder on PC or console and join a worldwide community of over 70 million players in epic PvP battles today. Play War Thunder for free using my link in the description or pinned comment. New players and those returning after 6 months get a massive bonus pack with multiple premium vehicles, 100,000 Silver Lions, the exclusive Eagle of Valor decorator, and 7 days of premium access. Available for a limited time only. Gaddafi is often referred to as Colonel Gaddafi, partly because his first name Muammar was difficult for Western observers to pronounce, and partly because he cultivated a martial reputation. It's an odd title for someone who was actually much more than a colonel, but Gaddafi had at least been a soldier. Born to a Bedouin family close to Sirte in the Libyan desert in 1942, Gaddafi graduated from university in 1963 and joined the military, where he rose through the ranks to become an officer. With fierce ideas on Arab nationalism and with a strong Muslim faith, Gaddafi decided early on that the Libyan king, Idris I, had to be deposed. And in 1969, he led a coup to topple the monarch. Following the birth of a new Libya, Gaddafi became the supreme commander of the armed forces and chairman of the Revolutionary Command Council, Libya's new ruling body. Expelling foreign military and economic interests from his nation's soil, Gaddafi strengthened his grip on power throughout the 1970s and began to shape his vision for the country's future. His book, titled The Green Book, published in 1974, made his political philosophies freely available to all. He envisioned a Libya based on a form of Islamic socialism that would set it apart from Western capitalist democracies and even from fellow Islamic and Arab nations. His Jamahiriya government, imposed in 1977, made Libya a sort of decentralized confederation of states, further broadening the division between the North African nation and its neighbors and increasing tensions with its global rivals. He would step down as chairman in 1979, but retained the title of brotherly leader, and no one was under any illusion as to who was really in charge. Over the coming decades, Gaddafi would become an almost mythical figure, leading Libya as a dictator while somehow standing apart from its system of governance. Repeated clashes with foreign leaders gave him a reputation that can be described as difficult and even downright dangerous. International tensions would be ratcheted up once again in 2009 when Gaddafi was elected to the seat of chairman at the African Union, or AU. As head of the AU, Gaddafi found that the broader international community could no longer ignore or effectively sideline him. It may have been a moment of optimism or even victory for the dictator, but the end was close at hand. Only 2 years later, he would be dead, but not before his nation had erupted once more into violence. In this video, we tell the story of this violence and of the bloody hardships endured by the Libyan people. Gaddafi is just one figure within a rich and complex cast of characters, but his peculiar shadow cannot fail to loom large over the recent history of Libya, and even over its present. On December 17, 2010, merchant Mohamed Bouazizi marched into his local governor's office in Benarous, Tunisia, and demanded to be heard. He'd been harassed by local market inspectors, assaulted, humiliated. And this wasn't the first instance. The governor, unwilling to waste his time listening to a lowly local trader lodge complaints against his own officers, sent Bouazizi away. Enraged, desperate, and with no legal recourse, Bouazizi left the governor's office. But rather than simply heading home, he fetched petrol and a lighter and he returned to the office building. Here, he doused himself with the fluid and set himself alight. He would die of his injuries on January 4th at only 26 years old. This was a shocking and tragic incident, and it appalled the citizens of Tunisia. Protests erupted across the country. Bouazizi had died alone, a wretched death, but Tunisians were eager to show that his suffering would not be in vain. The government of Zine Al Abidine Ben Ali kicked back and kicked back hard. Police units clashed with protesters, leaving dozens dead. When the protests didn't stop, the army was called in, but the anger in the country was unabated. On January 13th, 2011, Ben Ali bowed to the pressure. He addressed the nation via a television broadcast, promising to ease the economic hardship and political oppression that had gripped Tunisia under his tenure, and stating that he would step down as president at the end of his term in 2014. It was not enough. There were more protests, more clashes, more deaths. Ben Ali would step down on January 17th, a unity government was formed, and Tunisia began a long and difficult road to democracy. The Jasmine Revolution, as it was known, was a turning point in Tunisian history. But to the wider world, the events in Tunisia were the beginning of something far broader. The Arab Spring was a wave of political demonstrations, armed conflict, and regime changes that took place in the first months of 2011. After the self-immolation of Bouazizi, protests had begun in Egypt too, and when it became clear that the Tunisian dissenters were going to win, Egypt fell into its own armed rebellion. The forces of Hosni Mubarak fought to maintain their grip on the country, and many protesters were killed as a result. But by February, Mubarak's 32-year rule was over. Further east, Yemen erupted in revolts, almost simultaneously with Egypt. Here, there was bloodshed too, as Ali Abdullah Saleh resorted to force to retain his position at the head of government. The Yemeni crisis took far longer to resolve. Saleh himself would be badly injured in a bombing at his presidential palace and would eventually cede power the following year. Yemen's political crises are not over, however, as the nation remains in turmoil to this day. Elsewhere, the revolts in Syria would lead to a still ongoing bitter civil war, the effects of which are still being felt. In Bahrain, protesters succeeded in achieving concessions from their government, but a consolidation of power led to the reversal of those concessions in the years that followed. In Algeria, Jordan, Morocco, and Oman, leaders were left frightened by the events across the region and made significant constitutional changes. Sometimes successful, often only temporarily successful, and frequently not successful at all, the wave of protests that constituted the Arab Spring is almost unique in global history. A massive political movement comprised of atomized and distinct groups crossing national borders. This is a rare event and offers a fascinating glimpse into the Arab world at the turn of a new decade. But while the death of Mohamed Bouazizi may have kick-started the flourishing of rebellion, it was just the latest in a long line of injustices for the citizens of these nations, citizens who decided they had had enough. And nowhere was this truer than in Libya. Libya was not immune from the fervor of the Arab Spring. Gaddafi may have felt that he was a different class to his neighboring sovereigns, that his grip on power was stronger, but he was wrong. It took a little longer for things to really come to a head in Libya, but when they did, the result was horrific. It was February 2011 when human rights lawyer Fedi Tabel was arrested in Libya. On February 15th, anti-government protesters held rallies in Benghazi. They were met with water cannons and rubber bullets fired by security forces, and a bizarre show of national propaganda in which pro-government rallies were broadcast across the country on national television. By now, the seeds of discord had been sown across the Middle East and North Africa, and such moves were not going to placate the masses. The protests continued. Before the end of the month, the mood had shifted significantly. Saif al-Islam, son of Gaddafi, addressed the nation, expressing a desire to fight to the last bullet. there was no longer any desire to calm the protests. The government was ready to fight a war. But what brought us to this brink? Libyans were undoubtedly inspired by the events elsewhere in the region, but this inspiration didn't materialize out of thin air. The economic picture for Libya under Gaddafi was a confusing one. At first, it appeared positive. After a long period of stagnation throughout the 1990s, Libya's GDP began a sharp climb in the new millennium, essentially tripling between 2002 and 2008, before the 2008 economic crisis saw it slump once again. Per capita GDP rose from just under $3,800 in 2002 to almost $14,000 in 2008. Even the slump in 2008 and 2009 was countered by 5% growth in 2010, the final year of Gaddafi's rule. Inflation climbed over this period too, but remained lower than rates seen in the previous 2 decades. Meanwhile, the nation's manufacturing industry soared, generating $4 billion in 2008, 8 times the level of 2002, despite representing a proportion of total GDP as the economy diversified. This data doesn't suggest the beginnings of a revolution. So if Gaddafi wasn't exactly tanking the economy, what was going on? This formed part of Gaddafi's own argument, that he had been unfairly made a pariah in the West, and that, actually, he was a true champion of the Libyan people. However, a closer look at the data reveals a more complex picture. Healthcare spending, for example, rose in line with GDP between 2002 and 2008, but actually fell in terms of percentage of GDP over this time. At the same time, the maternal mortality rate began to grow once again after falling at the end of the 1990s. Libya's economy had seemingly flourished under Gaddafi, although it is clear that not everyone was benefiting from this increase in wealth. Of course, this situation isn't unique to Gaddafi's Libya. Across the world, in democracies and dictatorships alike, unequal wealth distribution makes life desperately hard. What's more, supporters of Gaddafi would argue that he in fact did a good job at easing this inequality. Under Gaddafi, healthcare and education were free. Unconfirmed figures suggest that more than 50% of Libyan university students in 2014 were women, compared to very few female attendees prior to Gaddafi's coup in 1967. Indeed, the ongoing crisis in Libya means that for many, life was probably somewhat better under Gaddafi than it is today. Unemployment, which fell steadily from 1992 to 2010, is now at almost 21% and is the 5th highest on the continent. Economic factors may have been key to the Jasmine Revolution that ripped through Tunisia, but may not have been quite so pivotal across the border in Libya. What about the social landscape of Libya? Well, this question is perhaps even more complex than the economic one. In 2020, the Libyan-American lawyer Muammar Gaddafi commented that no regime in the world has advocated, enacted, and at the same time violated human rights laws such as the Gaddafi regime. Gaddafi described how Gaddafi's Great Green Charter of Human Rights, enacted in 1988, protected the right to life, personal liberty, and security of individuals. In 1991, the promotion of the Freedom Act went further, granting every citizen the right to publicly express his thoughts and opinions in people's congresses and Jamahirian media. This sounds rather positive, but Gaddafi points out the following section. The exercise of this right shall not be questioned unless it is exploited to prejudice the authority of the people for personal purposes. The vagueness of the term authority of the people, which could equally mean the authority of Gaddafi himself as protector of the people, is something that Gaddafi found particularly troubling. The same year, Youssef Mohammed Sawani, writing in the University of California's journal Contemporary Arab Affairs, described how the comparative weakness of the government that followed has made state building, and perhaps most importantly, reconciliation, very difficult. Of course, this isn't to say that pre-2011 Libya was a paradise in which everyone experienced safety, protection, and freedom. Under Gaddafi, Libya certainly had the legal apparatus required to deal with criminals and political enemies. Statistics from 2010 found that 18 people were put to death in the country during Gaddafi's last full year of power, more than any other African state. But in the same period, The USA executed 46 people, so it's difficult to draw any definitive conclusion from this. Texas alone executed 17. However, these official figures do not include extrajudicial killings. Writing for the Physicians for Human Rights blog in 2011, Rachel Hastings detailed a report from the discovery of a mass grave in Tripoli. This mass grave, it was said, contained the bodies of 1,200 people who were massacred at the city's Abu Salim prison in 1996. It was alleged the government had full knowledge of this atrocity and covered it up. The social landscape of Libya in those years has been the source of much debate, but there's at least one fact we can reasonably be sure of. One of the key catalysts for the initial Arab Spring protests in Libya was the arrest of Fethi Tarbel, a human rights lawyer. This does at least tell us that elements of social discord and anger did contribute to some degree to the carnage that would follow. Finally, the political situation. In many senses, Gaddafi was the political situation. He was the man at the top and had been since the late 1960s. A monolithic figure, it's easy to overlook the intrigues and movements that may have been going on behind the scenes of the Gaddafi regime, but they certainly existed. The fact that so many of Gaddafi's leading ministers and strategists defected to the other side, including, but certainly not limited to, Musa Kusa, Mustafa Jalil, Abdul Fattah Yunus, and Shukri Ghanem, suggests significant disharmony within the Libyan political system in the years leading up to the conflict. It's also worth mentioning that Gaddafi had real enemies in exile overseas too. Both Khalifa Haftar and Ali Zaidan would be instrumental in the leader's downfall and in the transition to the phase of Libyan history that followed it, and each man had been forced to flee the country to escape from the regime's clutches. Haftar had been involved in an attempted coup against Gaddafi several years prior to the revolution. Perhaps the knives had been out for Gaddafi for some time already. It's also notable that, in the end, Gaddafi's inner circle was predominantly made up of his sons and his brother-in-law. After decades in power and through retaining the loyalty of the bulk of his armies, it seems Gaddafi had become politically isolated. The events of the Arab Spring may have simply given Gaddafi's political enemies, and Lord knows there were a lot of them, the opportunity to strike against the leader who had outstayed his welcome. Gaddafi ruled over Libya for 42 years. He was the 7th longest serving dictator since 1900 and had essentially been the author of his people's collective destinies for as long as many could remember. And yet, he would not see another year. His rise to power had been swift, and when the fall came, this would be swift too. Although his final hours would be horrendously drawn out. For Libyans who lived through the civil war in 2011, it might not have felt quite so swift. 9 months of fighting, tens of thousands of dead, hundreds of thousands displaced, the country and her people went through real trauma during this bloody year. But what exactly happened? How did the hopefulness of the Arab Spring descend into mass violence that uprooted so many and destroyed everything that had gone before? Let's take a look at the timeline, starting with February 2011. As protests erupt in Benghazi and Tripoli, the security forces take action. There are thousands of injuries and more than 200 deaths. It swiftly becomes clear that this is a significant crackdown even by Libyan standards, and the United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon attempts to bring an end to the conflict. Gaddafi, however, is unmoved. He follows up the defiant rhetoric from his son with a speech of his own on the 22nd. He states he will not relinquish power and would rather die a martyr. 2 days later, he doubles down on this attitude and begins making a series of claims about who and what is behind the unrest. He blames Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, still popular focuses for international outrage almost a decade after 9/11, and describes how protesters are under the influence of hallucinogenic drugs. As the Middle East and North Africa grow increasingly unstable, the eyes of the world are now on Libya. Barack Obama uses his presidential powers to freeze Gaddafi's assets in the US, while the UN Security Council and the European Union imposes its own asset freezes and arms embargo. The International Criminal Court receives a petition to try Gaddafi for his crimes against humanity. With February drawing to a close, a new potential leader emerges. Gaddafi's former justice minister, Mustafa Abdul Jalil, is selected as the head of the opposition rebel groups. Their aim is clear: Gaddafi must be toppled and Jalil must lead the caretaker government that will take Libya forward. Images of death and destruction in Libya are now flooding the world's news channels, and foreign leaders are under pressure to act. In the UK, David Cameron, less than a year into his term as Prime Minister, prepares to mobilise British forces. Opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn does not support intervention, but it goes ahead anyway on March 19th as French, British and American air and naval forces launch Operation Odyssey Dawn in an effort to enforce the UN Security Council's no-fly zone. On March 20th, Gaddafi expresses his dismay over the sudden escalation from Western forces. He states that Libya now has a right to defend itself from foreign attacks, and the rebellion totters toward an international conflict. 4 days later, NATO takes over the Odyssey Dawn mission, which becomes Operation Unified Protector, and on the 28th, Obama declares that the first phase of military action has been a success. As the second month of the conflict reaches its end, the situation looks grim for Gaddafi and his supporters. On March 30th, former Foreign Minister Moussa Koussa resigns and flees to the UK. The Libyan National Transitional Council, with Jalil at its head, grows increasingly legitimized on the world stage. The mood is shifting in Libya. Gaddafi, no longer bullish and defiant, appears uncertain, even conciliatory. Hopes begin to rise for a swift and diplomatic end to the conflict, and the African Union reports it's making progress toward a solution. The Libyan leader apparently reaches out directly to President Obama in a letter on April 6, requesting that NATO stop its bombing campaign. The action, Gaddafi says, constitutes an unjust war against a small people of a developing country. We have been hurt more morally than physically because of what had happened against us in both deeds and words by you, the letter apparently reads. Despite all this, you will always remain our son. The bombings do not stop. On April 30th, Gaddafi takes to his state TV channel, describing how he's open to the idea of a ceasefire, but says he will not step down. Sometime after this, possibly on the same day, a targeted NATO strike smashes into the house of Gaddafi's son, Saif al-Arab, where Gaddafi and his wife were residing at the time. Neither Gaddafi nor his wife are wounded, but Saif al-Arab is killed, along with a number of grandchildren, according to unconfirmed reports. The action is controversial. While Gaddafi is a legitimate target under international law, evidence of a significant civilian death toll casts a shadow on the NATO operation. It's also alleged that Saif al-Arab, not to be confused with Gaddafi's other son, Saif al-Islam, who had made the address back in February, had no active role in the regime. We regret all loss of life, especially the innocent civilians being harmed as a result of this ongoing conflict, Commander Lieutenant General Charles Boucard says, but he also reiterates that it is the Gaddafi regime which is causing so much suffering. Regime spokesman Musa Ibrahim seeks to rally Libyans around the death of Saif al-Arab and his innocent children. We will make Libya the grave of all invaders, he tells a crowd outside the smoking rubble of al-Arab's compound. If NATO had meant to send a message to Gaddafi, we can and will find you and strike you, it was loud and clear. The Libyan leader goes into hiding while the fighting continues to rage in the country. On May 13th, an audio message from Gaddafi is broadcast on Libyan state television. Tell the Crusader cowards, a voice that sounds very much like Gaddafi says, that I live in a place you cannot reach me. Amid rumors that the leader had been injured or even killed in NATO airstrikes, the broadcast is intended to steal the resolve of his remaining supporters. I live in the hearts of millions, he continues, and even if you kill my body, you cannot kill my soul that lives in the hearts of millions. The 1st of June brings another damaging loss for the regime. Oil Minister Shukri Ghanem leaves Libya and crosses the Mediterranean to Italy, where he tells journalists that the horror of the war is weighing heavily on his soul. This war is getting even worse every day and there's no end to it, and we'd like to end this thing peacefully and come back to a solution quickly to reinstate democracy and constitutional government, Ghanem says as he becomes the latest in a long list of defectors, which also includes the Libyan Foreign Minister, Moussa Koussa. In the first weeks of the new month, NATO pledges to extend its Libyan mission by a further 90 days while international pressure mounts on Gaddafi's regime. By now, Spain, Germany, Canada, the USA, Qatar, France, and Italy, among others, all recognize the National Transitional Council as the true government of Libya. Not everyone is convinced though. President of South Africa, Jacob Zuma, blasted the NATO operation as undermining the efforts of the African Union, of which Gaddafi had been the chairman, and engaging in regime change. As the month draws to its close, International Criminal Court prosecutor Luis Moreno Ocampo announces a number of arrest warrants for Gaddafi, his brother-in-law Abdullah al-Sanusi, and one of his surviving sons, Saif al-Islam. The charges amount to crimes against humanity, but Moreno Ocampo states that investigations are ongoing into a series of rapes perpetrated by Gaddafi's forces on Libyan women during the civil war. Moreno Ocampo is clear that the ICC considers Gaddafi culpable, but stresses that the rebels may have charges to answer to. As rebel groups continue to grow in strength, raiding a government weapons depot at Zintan almost at the same time the news of the ICC charges were breaking, Moreno Ocampo says that arrest warrants could be issued for opposition commanders and figures. Even at this stage, the course of the war is not yet a foregone conclusion. Along with the artillery barrages and NATO's aerial strikes, news reports from Libya are characterized by a highly mobile form of warfare, raiding parties and pickup trucks armed with machine guns, traversing highways and conducting rapid, brutal assaults. The highway between Brega and Ajdabiya has become a particular focus as government and rebel forces vie for control of the road and the surrounding area. Back in April, the pro-Gaddafi troops had occupied both towns, but Ajdabiya was retaken only 2 days after the government troops arrived. Since then, the two towns, separated by about 80 kilometers of roadway, have been the scene of scattered fighting, resulting in hundreds of casualties. By July, however, the rebels are preparing for an enormous assault to settle the matter once and for all. The government forces, supported by Belarusian military advisors, are not about to let this happen. The all-out offensive begins on July 14th. The rebel troops, now backed up with tanks and armored trucks, advance to within 20 kilometers of Brega. The Gaddafi loyalists at Brega allege that NATO is providing air support to the rebels in direct contravention of their mandate. The initial attack loses momentum, but a fresh assault on the 16th brings the rebel vanguard into the outskirts of Brega until, once again, they're pushed back. Brutal and often confusing fighting continues in and around Brega for the next 5 days. Navigating minefields and, at one point, a trench network filled with flaming oil, the rebels find progress difficult and are not able to take control of the town. They pull back, considering their next move. The following week, the rebel advance is dealt another blow. General Abdul Fattah Yunis, the top rebel commander, is assassinated in Benghazi on July 29th, along with 2 of his senior officers. The Gaddafi regime may be hanging by a thread, but it's not out of the fight just yet. Despite a significant setback, the rebel forces are back on the offensive in the first weeks of August. On the 6th, the 4th Battle of Brega begins, another concerted effort to dislodge Gaddafi loyalists in the area. As NATO strikes intensify, the rebel operations are less costly and the mood is confident. By August 19th, NATO can no longer hide the fact that the nature of its mission has shifted. The UN Security Council resolution stated that the NATO mission was one of protection and defense for civilians. However, the accusations leveled at commanders following the death of Saif al-Arab and the action at Brega are becoming increasingly difficult to deny. What was initially supposed to be a neutral intervention to protect civilians that were threatened specifically in Benghazi has morphed into being largely a one-sided affair to support the Libyan rebel force to overthrow Gaddafi, says Markus of the Council on Foreign Relations. On August 22nd, Brega falls to the rebels. The way is now clear for a push westwards along the curve of the Gulf of Sidra towards Sirte, the loyalist stronghold and birthplace of Gaddafi himself. They waste no time in pressing home their advantage. According to some reports, they begin their advance the very next day, clearly seeking a swift victory. In actuality, 2 months of fighting and hundreds of casualties still lay ahead of them. The rebel victory at Brega is far from an isolated incident. Opposition forces are advancing on Tripoli, and a bloody battle ensues in which thousands are killed. Saif al-Islam is captured on the 21st, although the city itself will not completely fall until the 28th. Confusion reigns as Tripoli burns. Another of Gaddafi's sons is reported killed, but is later revealed to have escaped, along with Abdullah al-Sanusi. Gaddafi himself is nowhere to be found. With the capital Tripoli now in the hands of the National Transitional Council, the world begins making plans for a new Libya. But with Gaddafi still at large and loyalist forces still holding on to pockets of territory, the war is not yet over. The writing was certainly on the wall though. In September, both Russia and China would publicly recognize the NTC as the only government structure extant in Libya. There is now almost no international support for the deposed leader. Interim Prime Minister Mahmoud Jabril addresses the United Nations on September 24th, stating that the nation is ready to redevelop itself and heal its wounds. Foreign banks begin to release assets that had been frozen at the outbreak of the war. Libya looks to the future, while rumors circulate about the status of its former dictator. In Sirte, the war is clearly not over. Across the city, battles rage, with brutal house-to-house fighting erupting around key strategic points. As the situation grows increasingly desperate, the loyalists resort to grim and often horrific tactics. Streets are flooded with sewage to halt the NTC's advance, and civilians who could not escape the fighting are pressured into joining the loyalist cause. NTC soldiers report finding dozens of civilian bodies executed because they were either unwilling or unable to lift a rifle in defense of the dictatorship. By October 12th, the NTC claimed to have captured 80% of the city, but a solid core of resistance remains. That evening, it is claimed that Gaddafi's son Mu'tasim has been captured, but once again this claim is found to be false. In the coming days, loyalist troops are able to mount a counterattack, pushing the line of control back by 2 kilometers. But soon, the NTC are back on the advance, regaining territory and pushing the loyalists back into the Al-Dola region of the city. More executed civilian bodies are identified, and it's clear just how heavy a toll the war has already exacted on the populace. On the 19th, the opposition commander states that loyalists are now holed up in an area less than 1 kilometer square. Precisely what happened in the bloody chaos of October 20th has never been fully confirmed, probably never will be. Around 8 AM, the NTC began their final assault on the loyalist position. Minutes before this, however, a convoy of rebel motor vehicles staged an audacious breakout, sallying forth from their stronghold and tearing away toward the coastal highway. In a hail of gunfire, around 20 of the escapees are killed, but others succeed in fleeing. Back in Sirte, it takes the NTC around an hour and a half to sweep the Al-Dola enclave. Of course, the bizarre and chaotic events of that morning sent the rumor mill into overdrive. Gaddafi himself had been part of the convoy. He had escaped again. Or had he? News began to circulate that he had been killed in the gunfire that followed the loyalists down the highway, or by a NATO drone or a Tornado aircraft. Then, further conflicting reports. He was still alive, simply wounded in the legs, and was being treated in hospital. Once recuperated, he would face justice. His son Mu'tasim too, although yet more reports suggested Mu'tasim had indeed been killed during the escape. But remember, this was a new age, an age of documentation, an age of information and communication. It didn't take long for camera phone videos to emerge, showing a bloody and disheveled Gaddafi taunted and beaten by a mob that bayed for his blood. The world, which had been gripped by the ongoing saga of the Libyan Revolution like it was some kind of televised drama packaged neatly for televisual consumption, was confronted by its shame. The grim reality of death, of torture and humiliation was splashed across screens and newspaper pages the world over. The images of Gaddafi's body on a mortuary slab offer some insight into the final minutes of the dictator. Dirty and covered with wounds, Gaddafi's fall from power is mapped out across his flesh, and across the flesh of his son too. The images of Mu'tasim show a similar level of brutality wrought upon it. A wound gapes at his throat, and his arms have been wrenched from their sockets at the shoulders. An NTC spokesperson describes how Mu'tasim had been killed while trying to escape, and that his body was, regrettably, mutilated post-mortem. However, a video of a beaten and defeated Mu'tasim, sipping water from a plastic bottle, smoking a cigarette, and appearing calmly resigned to his fate, are proof that the man was captured alive. No footage exists of his subsequent execution, but there's a high chance it was as brutal and drawn out as that of his father. It would take NTC forces another few days to bring Sirte under complete control. While the opposition spokesman had condemned the actions of loyalist troops in those desperate final days, what followed was similarly disturbing. Evidence began to emerge of summary executions carried out on captured loyalists. As many as 300 are believed to have been executed after their surrender, although this figure could be even higher. The ICC had brought charges of crimes against humanity against Gaddafi and his leading allies, most likely with very good reason and compelling evidence. However, the actions of the NTC during and after the fall of Sirte, and even in the months leading up to this fall, would also constitute war crimes. By the end of October 2011, the revolution that had begun 9 months before was over. A leader in power for almost half a century lay dead, and now Libya looked to the future and what would come next. The nation had been ripped apart at the seams, and now the rocky road to recovery must begin. Despite outward appearances, the Libyan civil war was a complex affair, as competing interests, political ideologies, and tribal loyalties collided in a maelstrom of death and destruction. It's difficult to know precisely who was responsible for what during the conflict, but let's try to pin down some of the key players and notable figures. Muammar Gaddafi. We've already covered Muammar Gaddafi at length, but as the supreme leader of Libya from 1969 to his death in 2011, we need to touch upon him once again here. His rise from modest beginnings in a poor Bedouin family to his position at the head of the nation drew much international admiration, but his reign has led to a complex legacy. Some maintain Gaddafi was a champion for African identity, pan-Arab unity, and social reform. Others believe he was simply a power-mad, unnecessarily aggressive dictator and threat to national and international stability. Saif al-Islam Gaddafi. The second son of Gaddafi, Saif al-Islam, was an important figure as the regime clung to power. After initially supporting the Tunisian uprising, al-Islam began to make inflammatory statements on behalf of his own father, as similar uprisings erupted in Libya. Later, in April 2011, he attempted to broker peace with the NTC's Ali Zaidan, but this was unsuccessful. Captured in October 2011, al-Islam faced trial for his actions during the revolution, but was never handed over to the International Criminal Court. Released in 2011, al-Islam returned to politics and is still alive as of March 2024. Kamis Gaddafi. Kamis was Gaddafi's youngest son and was in fact working in the United States when war broke out. He hurriedly returned to the land of his birth, serving as a trusted advisor to his father and also commanding the Kamis Brigade. Kamis was a major target for rebels during the conflict, and numerous reports of his death emerged. It seems likely that Kamis was killed on August 29th in a NATO airstrike near Tarhuna. It's suspected that the International Criminal Court was planning to bring a case against Kamis. Mu'tasim Gaddafi. Mu'tasim was Gaddafi's fourth son and was known in the years before the war as something of an international playboy and jet-setter, dating models and holding Caribbean parties complete with rumored performances from Mariah Carey and Beyonce. Dogged by accusations of pimping and sexual assault, Mu'tasim was largely a peripheral figure in the Gaddafi regime, but did end up alongside his father at the Sirte stronghold in the war's final weeks. He was captured the same day as his father and executed around the same time. Abdullah Sanusi. Abdullah Sanusi married the sister of Gaddafi's wife in either 1979 or 1980 and became a close friend and confidante of the leader. He served the regime in various capacities, including as the head of military intelligence. Numerous charges of crimes against humanity were leveled against him, and despite numerous rumors that he had been killed in the conflict, he was arrested in Mauritania in September 2012. A death sentence passed down by a Libyan court in 2015 drew great ire from his supporters, particularly from his own tribal leaders. The death sentence was never carried out, but Sanusi remained in detention as recently as December 2022. There were no plans to comply with the United States' extradition request. Mustafa Jalil. Mustafa Jalil served as an assistant to the public prosecutor in Beira, Libya, before becoming a judge in 1978. He was known for frequently ruling against the regime, but eventually became justice minister in 2007. After attempting to resign in 2010, Jalil was always a likely candidate to switch sides, and he became the first senior figure to do so in February 2011. He would become the de facto leader of Libya as chairman of the National Transitional Council, despite accusations that he had been involved in the assassination of rebel commander Abdul Yunis. Khalifa Haftar. Haftar was a veteran commander who had served Gaddafi ably since his rise to power at the end of the 1960s. After a failed uprising against the leader in 1996, however, Haftar was forced to flee to the USA. As war broke out in 2011, Haftar returned to assist the rebels with his own military experience, although there are conflicting reports as to his own role within the rebel forces' chain of command. After the revolution, Haftar would rise to prominence once again as the leader of the Libyan National Army, which supported the House of Representatives during the Second Libyan Civil War. Abdul Fattah Yunis. Yunis had been a member of Gaddafi's inner circle after supporting him during the coup of 1969. He was known to the West after his cordial meeting with British officials in 1992, in which he apparently expressed regret over the death of PC Fletcher and offered to extradite the killers. As such, Yunis was another early defector to the rebels but would not see the end of the war, as he was assassinated in mysterious circumstances in Benghazi on July 28th. At his funeral, Yunis' son apparently expressed his own support for the Gaddafi regime his father had rebelled against. Ali Zaidan. Ali Zaidan was a human rights lawyer and former diplomat who had spent decades in exile following his defection from the Gaddafi regime in 1980. He would later become Prime Minister of Libya in the years following Gaddafi's demise and would be subject to a number of kidnappings as the nation fell once again into civil war. Robert Gates. Former CIA man Robert Gates was notable in that he served as Secretary of Defense under both the Republican George W. Bush and his Democrat successor Barack Obama. Gates directed the American-led Operation Odyssey Dawn and the US's contribution to Operation Unified Protector until he retired and was replaced by Leon Panetta, actually 5 years his senior, in June 2011. Gates hinted at the limitations of an armed response, stating that military forces are just one way to bring peace to Libya. Charles Bouchard. Charles Bouchard, originally from Quebec in Canada, was the commander of the NATO military mission in Libya. While the conflict was still going on, Bouchard was awarded the Meritorious Service Cross. He would retire the following year, taking up a civil position with Lockheed Martin. Hamad bin Ala Altia. Al Altia was Qatar's long-standing Minister for Defense as war broke out in Libya. As Chief of Staff for the Qatari Armed Forces, he was largely responsible for overseeing the deployment of troops in support of anti-Gaddafi rebels. While non-NATO members, Sweden, Jordan and the UAE provided military support to Operation Unified Protector, Qatar operated outside this remit. They were the only nation to provide official, active and unlimited military support to either side during the conflict. Alexander Lukashenko. Alexander Lukashenko became president of Belarus in 1994, an office he still holds as of March 2024. There's significant evidence that Belarus directly supported Gaddafi's forces during the revolution, offering military advisors and being accused of providing weapons, munitions, and even troops on active duty. We'll come back to this later on, although it is important to stress that Lukashenko has always denied these charges. A civil war, the fall of a dictator. These words imply an internal struggle, closed off from the outside world. Armies of compatriots facing off against one another. But this is very rarely the case, particularly in the modern age. An interconnected world means that internal struggles take on a far broader significance. At the very least, The outside world watches and passes comments. In many cases, however, the outside world becomes directly involved. Rwanda, 1994. Srebrenica, Bosnia, 1995. Monrovia, Liberia, 1996. Events in which the will and resolve of the international community had been tested and had failed. In some senses, heavy international involvement in a conflict like the Libyan civil war was written long before it began. A nation just beyond the boundaries of Europe, a dictator who had been a thorn in the side of the West for decades. When we take this into account, NATO planes striking targets in Libya seems almost like an inevitability. There can be little doubt that NATO's use of force had a determining effect on the outcome of the war. The complaints raised by the loyalist defenders at Brega were of course factual. NATO was indeed intervening directly in the conflict and was not limiting its actions to defending civilians. In fact, civilians were alleged to have been killed by the strikes themselves. Numbers are difficult to independently verify, but non-combatant deaths seem likely. In August, Markus made his statement admitting a shift in focus in the NATO campaign. In actuality, he needn't have bothered. NATO's own publicly available operational media updates for the period of June 24th to July 13th show the destruction of 22 tanks, trucks, and other vehicles, as well as 46 strikes on military installations. The rebels had men, they had weapons, and they had a strong chain of command, but their advances were certainly aided by the NATO involvement. But surely this was in contravention of the United Nations Security Council's resolution. Perhaps not. The resolution allowed some flexibility in its definition of protecting the civilian populace. Under the terms of the resolution, it could be argued that any strike upon a loyalist target at any point during the hostilities contributed to civilian protection, even if civilians were not in the direct line of fire at that particular moment. Indeed, Chris de Kock, writing in the Yearbook of International Humanitarian Law in December 2011 states, "It's unlikely that UNSCR 1973 was violated, even if the attacks indirectly advantaged the anti-Gaddafi forces in their non-international armed conflict with the pro-Gaddafi forces." De Kock lists 260 aircraft involved in Operation Unified Protector, flying 26,500 sorties, including 9,700 strike sorties. 21 naval vessels were also involved in the operation, which brought together forces from NATO member states as well as non-NATO members Sweden, Jordan, and the UAE. The actions of non-member Qatar, which was also involved in the conflict but outside the Unified Protector mandate, are not included in de Kock's report. In total, more than 5,900 military objectives were destroyed by NATO, all of which, de Kock says, would have been considered legitimate under the terms of the resolution. He concludes his piece for the yearbook by reiterating that the main focus of the operation was to prevent the attacks and threat of attacks on civilians. De Kock's analysis is a fairly open one. He prefers to analyze the legality of the operation rather than the ethical should they or shouldn't they question. However, this ethical question does have its own legal precedent. The responsibility to protect, also known as R2P, was first introduced in the World Summit Outcome document 6 years earlier in 2005. The following year, Security Council Resolution 1674 referenced this document directly. The Security Council could and would, and many believed should, respond with force in the protection of civilians during armed conflict. Writing in the International Review of the Red Cross, Bruno Pommier discussed how these precedents gave NATO the right and even the duty to act. Although he admits that the full scale of the damage caused had not yet been made known, Pommier was writing in the weeks following the end of the war, so he was absolutely right to be cautious. As we'll see later on, the subsequent aftermath of the conflict cast a grim shadow on the NATO operation. Not everyone was so convinced that NATO forces had acted within their remit. Alan J. Cooperman, writing for the Journal of International Security in 2013, argued that NATO had used excessive force and unnecessarily aggressive tactics in the execution of its mission. Cooperman stated that the intervention in Libya began with the desire to protect civilians, but had morphed into a full-on regime change only a few weeks later. If NATO had prioritized the protection of civilians in accordance with its authorization, Cooperman wrote, the Transatlantic Alliance would have enforced the no-fly zone, bombed forces that were threatening civilians, and attempted to forge a ceasefire. Instead, Cooperman continued, NATO took actions that were unnecessary or inconsistent with protecting civilians, but which fostered regime change. Less than 2 weeks into the intervention, for example, NATO began attacking Libyan forces that were retreating and therefore not a threat to civilians who were far away. At the same time, NATO started bombing forces in Gaddafi's hometown of Sirte, where they represented no threat to civilians because the residents supported the regime. Cooperman quotes a New York Times report from the final stages of the conflict, which said, "Western powers were now attacking the Libyan army in retreat, a far cry from the United Nations mandate to establish a no-fly zone to protect civilians." He also quoted a loyalist spokesman who claimed that Libyan forces were attacked as they were clearly moving westbound in retreat. Other commentators went further. In his book Slouching Towards Sirte, published in 2012, Maximilian Forte describes the creeping impact of neoliberalism in the West's attitude to Africa and describes the idea of protection of civilians as a mere fig leaf for regime change. Whether you subscribe to Forte's view that intervention in Libya was nothing more than a new version of African colonialism, or you think that Gaddafi was a murderous despot who needed to be toppled, or if you sit somewhere in between, the facts of the matter are the same. NATO played a significant role, rightly or wrongly, in the outcome of an internal conflict. Russia's frosty relationship with NATO did not begin with the annexation of Crimea in 2014. For years before this, the Russian Federation eyed NATO with suspicion, particularly on the question of foreign intervention. It's no surprise then that Vladimir Putin was not in support of Operation Unified Protector. In March, Russia opted to abstain from the UNSC's vote on Resolution 1973. But why abstain? Why not vote against it? James M. Dorsey, writing for the Yale University website in September 2011, believed that the situation put Russia in an awkward position. More than 11 years after he first came to power, Putin was in the process of transforming his democratic position into an autocratic one. He would become president the following year, with Dmitry Medvedev in the position of prime minister. And so, the Russian leader would stop short of offering out-and-out support to a leader who had come to encapsulate the Western view of the military strongman dictator. Like others, Putin probably also foresaw the inevitable conclusion. NATO would surely win, Gaddafi would fall, and so Russia must take a back seat. Instead, Putin was able to sit on the sidelines and actively decry what he viewed to be NATO's war crimes. While Russia officially recognized the transitional government as the legitimate power in Libya from September 1st, he still leveled accusations against NATO and the USA in particular. In December, Putin spoke on Russian television about the horrible, disgusting scenes of Gaddafi's death and claimed that America was directly involved in the dictator's grim end. Dorsey believed that the events of the war would have a profound effect on Russian foreign policy, leading to an intensification of operations in Syria, where Bashar al-Assad was still in power despite immense pressure from his own set of rebels. Dorsey's prediction, it transpired, would turn out to be correct. China also abstained from the vote on Resolution 1973. The PRC had limited economic interests in the country, although it did evacuate more than 35,000 of its citizens in the weeks leading up to the war. Similar to Russia, China perhaps did not want to outwardly support a long-serving dictator, but similarly could not put their weight behind a NATO operation on foreign soil. There were allegations, however, that China was working behind the scenes. In September 2011, a Canadian journalist published the details of attempted arms deals between China and the Gaddafi regime. The PRC's arms manufacturing companies, all of which were state-owned, offered weaponry worth $200 million to the loyalists. The journalist, Graham Smith, claimed to have found these documents in a trash pile in the Bab Akra neighborhood of Tripoli. Officials in the US did not pass comment on the documents, while a NATO diplomat in Brussels said that Smith's claims were highly unlikely. These accusations led to more confusion over the limits of international law. The arms embargo on Libya was understood to mean that no weaponry could be sold or delivered to anyone within the country, and yet France had been accused of providing arms directly to rebel units. Smith also said that he believed at least 10 other nations were supplying Gaddafi with weapons. Whether the accusations were true has never been confirmed. Outwardly, China remained on the sidelines like Russia. Perhaps, as Douglas H. Paul believed, they were concerned about potentially isolating themselves on the world stage after trying unsuccessfully to gain support from Arab League and African Union members. But the PRC was arguably more vocal than Russia in its criticism of NATO. China claimed the mission had gone well beyond its remit and had even resulted in the deaths of the civilians it was supposed to protect. PRC President Hu Jintao even attacked some members of the NATO coalition personally, such as his French counterpart Nicolas Sarkozy. Belarus's involvement seems more likely. Not a member of the United Nations Security Council, Belarus apparently sent military advisors to the conflict, and the presence of these advisors on the ground has been reported at numerous points throughout the war. Numerous flights were also tracked between the two countries while civil war raged, including planes between Tripoli and a military base in Belarus, allegedly carrying weapons and ammunition. Other reports described men who look European fighting for the loyalist side, suggesting that Belarus was also sending personnel into active service at the front. President Alexander Lukashenko denied these claims, although the Daily Telegraph reported in April 2011 that they had spoken to a Belarusian mercenary who was paid £1,900 a month to serve in Libya. On the subject of mercenaries, Russia alleged that rebel troops were also relying on soldiers of fortune from outside the country, as well as the support from NATO, but this has never been confirmed. What was his crime? Ghanaian reggae artist Black Rasta sang on a track on his 2012 album, Born Dread. He wanted the African currency for his oil. He wanted to pay the price. He was slaughtered like a dog on his own soil. And Black Rasta goes on. Free food, shelter, healthcare and education he gave to his people, as a champion of all African socialists. Even if you've never heard this song before, you can probably guess its simple one-word title, Gaddafi. Black Rasta, or Abu Bakr Ahmed, had made music about political figures before. Surprisingly enough, he scored a big hit in Ghana a few years prior with a track singing the praises of Barack Obama, and he even met the American president in 2009. In the spring of 2011, his opinions changed radically. He became an outspoken critic of what he called Western hypocritical capitalists while describing the death of Gaddafi as the deliberate assassination of Africa's savior. Of course, Black Rasta is a popular singer in West Africa and his opinions carry a lot of weight, but he's not at the head of an armed forces. He's not running a country. He also doesn't represent the voice of all Ghanaians and certainly not all Africans. An article published on Ghana Web in 2020 described how Gaddafi continues to divide opinion in Ghana. This certainly suggests that not everyone goes along with Ahmed's African savior view, but also tells us he's not universally hated. Go for a stroll around Philadelphia, Manchester, Toulouse, or Adelaide, and the consensus on Gaddafi is probably a bit more clear-cut. The article goes on to discuss how Gaddafi was no stranger to international conflict himself. There's a bit of hearsay and finger-pointing here, but basically the article alleges that Gaddafi was directly involved in supporting the National Patriotic Front of Liberia in 1989, providing money and weaponry as well as training. Similar accusations are made about Libyan involvement in the Sierra Leone War between 1991 and 2002, as well as allegations that Gaddafi sent troops to Sudanese President Ghaffar Nimari ready for deployment against the country's own rebel uprising. Other accusations are a lot easier to verify. In 1997, Libya fought a war with Egypt on their eastern border, although this swiftly came to an end. In 1987, Gaddafi invaded Chad. The then Chadian president, Hissène Habré, had the backing of the United States and France, and the eventual defeat was a costly one for Libya. All of these accusations may be true, or just those regarding Egypt and Chad, but it's certain that Gaddafi was no stranger to international conflict on his native continent. This, by itself, gives him a complicated legacy. Despite the presence of Belarus's military advisors and the unofficial involvement of Tuareg mercenaries from Mali, Niger, and Chad, Gaddafi had no active state allies in the conflict. While the African Union did not always speak with one voice, Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni and Zimbabwe's Robert Mugabe both announced their support for Gaddafi, no nation actually offered anything more than encouraging words to their brother leader. While some quarters, such as the leaders of Ethiopia and Nigeria, openly despised Gaddafi, the prevailing desire of the African Union was one of peace from the outset. Something that most leaders seemed to understand, however, was that the end was growing near for Gaddafi. Mauritanian President Mohamed Ould Abdelaziz chaired a meeting in February 2011 in which the AU discussed the Libyan question. As the Arab Spring ripped across North Africa and the Middle East, it quickly became clear that Gaddafi's days were numbered, and their thoughts turned toward minimizing the damage the conflict would cause. For neighboring leaders, however, there were other concerns. The Chadian leader, Idriss Déby, who had served in the armed forces during Chad's civil war and its own conflict with Libya in 1987, warned of opening the Libyan Pandora's box. A Peace and Security Council was set up, developing a roadmap that would bring the conflict to an end. This roadmap failed, and the AU found themselves increasingly sidelined as NATO's intervention ramped up. In some senses, though, the African Union voted themselves into this position. The AU has 3 seats on the United Nations Security Council, provided on a rotational basis. When it came to vote on intervention, UNSC Resolution 1973, the AU members present were Gabon, Nigeria, and South Africa. According to the UN's press release at the time, all 3 voted in favor, although this contradicts a quote from the Russian Parliament's International Affairs Committee chairman, Konstantin Kosachev, which cited South Africa's abstention. Indeed, abstaining does seem more in line with President Jacob Zuma's often staunchly anti-intervention position. The African Union's perceived failure to act and its inability or even unwillingness to handle a continental matter internally was damaging. It would take years for the AU to regain its position of respect and prestige on the wider stage of global diplomacy. It feels callous to distill such a monumental tragedy into cold facts and figures, but in many cases this is the only way to really get a handle on the scale of what took place. In 2015, the African Journal of Emergency Medicine published a study by Libyan researchers Mohamed A. Dor, Abdallah E. Bozedi, and Agnia A. Dow. The study examined 35% of Libya's land area and 62.4% of its population, and it found that 21,490 people lost their lives during the conflict. This gave Libya an overall mortality rate of 5.1 per 1,000 between February 2011 and February 2012. Injury figures were placed at 19,700, or 4.7 per 1,000 across the year, as well as 435,000 people displaced by the fighting. According to the researchers, the peak rates for injury and death occurred during July and August 2011 as the rebel advance intensified. This largely mirrors the official figures from the conflict, which range between 9,400 and 25,000 deaths, with 4,000 missing and 50,000 wounded. Government forces are believed to have lost between 3,000 and 4,300 soldiers, while the rebels lost up to 6,300 soldiers. No NATO personnel lost their lives. A number of journalists were killed during the conflict, including Qatar's Al-Hassan Al-Jaber, Libya's Mohammed Nabous, and British-American Tim Hetherington, among others. Other journalists were detained, such as James Foley, who was released after 44 days in captivity, but would go on to be brutally beheaded by Islamic State forces in Syria 3 years later. War crimes were perpetrated by both sides during the conflict, although UN investigators said they believed that loyalist war crimes were more severe and more widespread than those of the rebels. A later report from the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights found that ethnic groups such as the Tawegas, the Tebos, and the Al-Ahali suffered terribly during the conflict, and that abuses had continued far beyond the toppling of Gaddafi in 2011. A report from Physicians for Human Rights, published in August 2011, went into harrowing detail about some of these alleged crimes. Mohammed, 40, a volunteer ambulance driver. On March 17, 2011, Mohammed said he was blocked while transporting a severely injured civilian and forced out of his vehicle by loyalist troops. He was savagely beaten with rifle butts and a metal bar. The metal bar was jammed into Mohammed's mouth, and he was driven to a checkpoint where he was robbed. Later, he was thrown in the back of a semi-truck with 22 other victims. When one of his fellow detainees complained about their treatment, Mohammed alleged he was shot in the back of the head with a Kalashnikov rifle. Mohammed, 25, a civilian from Karzaz. On March 18th, Mohammed was arrested and tortured by soldiers loyal to the regime. He was held for 6 days and tortured twice more before he was assisted in his escape by an elderly cook. The ordeal left him blind in one eye and shattered his jaw. In a particularly tragic report, a civilian living in the village of Tomina was said to have recounted the abduction of his 3 daughters, aged 15, 17, and 18, by loyalist troops. On their return to their family home, they confided in their father that they had been held in Al-Wadi Al-Adar Elementary School, a makeshift detention center, and raped repeatedly for 3 consecutive days. The father then said he had slit the throat of each daughter in an effort to bring honor back to his family. Other citizens of Tomina corroborated that such honor killings had taken place after around 50 local girls, some as young as 14, were raped. Local community and religious leaders are believed to have spoken up against this horrific practice. Abdullah, 38, alleged that Gaddafi's troops used 107 captured civilians as human shields against NATO attacks on a position close to Kararim. There were no reported injuries or deaths. Adam, 21, a rebel fighter. Adam reported that Gaddafi's troops had beaten his extended family, including women and children. Soldiers put a gun against the head of his cousin, 25-year-old medic, and beat his father savagely. Adam's father was then taken away in a truck, and there was no news as to his whereabouts or well-being at the time the report was published. The report goes into less detail on alleged rebel war crimes, but acknowledges that they likely did take place. Alleged abuses include inhumane treatment of migrant workers, summary execution of foreign nationals from Niger, Chad, Syria, and Algeria, rape inflicted on women in Ajdabiya, Al-Mash, and Benghazi, arson, looting, and criminal damage, execution of captured enemy troops. Similarly, the report acknowledges that allegations of NATO war crimes exist, but covers these in only scant details. Accusations include the deaths of up to 700 civilians in airstrikes, 85 civilian casualties at Majer on August 9th, 11 imams killed in Tripoli on May 13th, 15 injuries caused by a strike on state television infrastructure directly contravening a 2006 Security Council resolution, 9 civilians killed in Tripoli on June 19th, which has been acknowledged by NATO officials, and excessive damage to civilian infrastructure across the course of the war. While the conflict was relatively short compared to other civil wars, it exacted a heavy toll on Libya. Infrastructure was shattered across the country. Almost 100% of the country had access to electricity in 2000, falling to just 70% in 2017. While access to clean water and sanitation was far lower, only 29% in 2000, this too had slumped to 26% by 2017. As the conflict drew to a close in the autumn of 2011, the world's media, particularly the West, was full of praise for the United Nations mission. It had, many believed, averted a far greater bloodbath and brought a relatively quick end to what could have been a drawn-out conflict. There may be some truths here, at least in the short term. Had the rebels not had NATO backing, Gaddafi may have held out for longer, causing more military and civilian deaths. He may even have won and exacted bloody revenge on those who opposed him. In a cold, mathematical sense, ending the war after 8 months with 22,000 dead is objectively better than ending it after 4 years with potentially more than 100,000 lives lost. But as we shall see, an unqualified celebration of NATO's role in the conflict would prove to be short-sighted. Precious is not Libyan. She comes from Nigeria. In 2017, a woman in her hometown in the south of the country came to her with an opportunity. The woman claimed she would help her get to Italy and find work as a seamstress. Earning good wages, she could support her family back in Nigeria. Precious jumped at the chance. The journey was an arduous one. In Niger, things began to get really bad for Precious and her companions. Running low on food, some of her party starved to death. Those who complained were beaten. As their Toyota Hilux vehicles crossed the border into Libya, it became clear that no one was going to Italy. Together with dozens of other women from sub-Saharan Africa, Precious was held against her will, forced to become a sex slave, an unwilling prostitute for the financial gain and sexual gratification of her captors. By some miracle, Precious escaped her captivity in 2019 and was flown back to Nigeria on a UN flight. She'll never forget the 2 years of hell she endured in Libya and how many of those just like her would never live to taste freedom again. Libya is a bad place, Precious, who understandably didn't want to give her full name, told the Financial Times in 2021. There are no laws there. They say since Gaddafi died, everything has changed. But how can this be? A dictator removed, a transitional government in place, a conflict resolved? The way should have been clear for peace and prosperity in Libya post-2011. To understand this, we need to go back to those first few months after the death of Gaddafi at the tail end of 2011 and the beginning of 2012. Something that was often missed in the West's coverage of the conflict is just how diverse Libya truly was and still is. It was simply easier to view the Libyan crisis as a binary struggle, the people, whoever they may be, and a murderous dictator with his armies. In fact, the people refers to individuals from more than 140 tribes, each with their own culture, identity, and history. In the western parts of the country in particular, many of these tribes had fought against Gaddafi, but not necessarily for the National Transitional Council. As the war ended and an interim government was set up in the east of the country, these tribes were now expected to submit to their new overlords, something many of them were just not prepared to do. Small-scale fighting continued as tribal militias disagreed over territory in the western reaches of Libya, and the NTC struggled to keep the fractious country under control. When the nation went to the polls in its first general election the following year, militias from the Tubu ethnic group disrupted voting and prevented at least one polling station from opening until the following day. In Benghazi, activists championing the cause of independence for the Cyrenaica region also attacked polling booths. Despite this, more than 60% of Libyan voters turned out and a General National Congress was elected. This GNC would then vote on a prime minister, a cabinet, and a new constitution for the country. But there were inevitable fractures in this multi-party system. The Congress members, spread across two main parties, four minor parties, and a large number of independent politicians, struggled to reach an agreement on anything. As the security and stability of Libya began once again to deteriorate, reaching Western newspaper front pages with the now infamous assassination of the US ambassador to Libya and his staff in Benghazi in 2012, the GNC sought to quell tensions. They elected an independent candidate, Nouri Abu Samain, as president in June 2013, but armed groups continued to grow in strength within the country. In October 2013, the Libya Revolutionary Operations Room, or LROR, kidnapped the Liberal Prime Minister Ali Zaidan, seeking to strengthen the presidential position of Abu Samain. In January 2014, the LROR kidnapped Egyptian diplomats in Libya, stoking both internal and external tensions. There were many factors that drew Libya closer and closer to a second conflict in only 3 years, but two of the biggest flashpoints were the nation's political isolation laws and the erosion of women's rights under Abu Samain. The GNC passed the isolation laws essentially to lay down the ghost of the Gaddafi regime for good. Anyone who had been involved in that regime would be excluded from holding public office. Needless to say, not everyone was happy with this, especially those looking to rehabilitate their political careers after the fall of the dictator in 2011. As for women's rights, the presence of the known liberal and former human rights lawyer Ali Zaidan in government gave many Libyan progressives hope for a freer, more open society in the future. Abu Samain, though, viewed by many as a compromise candidate between the progressives and their more conservative Islamist counterparts, reversed many of these liberalizing moves. The same month that Zaidan was kidnapped, the GNC was due to step down and leave the way clear for the next phase of Libyan governance. They didn't do this, instead extending their mandate without going to the people. The Tobruk-based House of Representatives claimed that the GNC was acting illegally and unconstitutionally. General Khalifa Haftar of the House of Representatives-aligned Libyan National Army demanded that the Congress step down in February, but his threats were denounced by the GNC as an attempted coup. After less than 3 years of very fragile peace, the dark clouds of war were gathering again over Libya. While the first official shots of the Second Libyan Civil War would be fired in May by General Haftar's LNA, the LROR would arguably get there first. In March, prosecutors with alleged ties to the group stormed the GNC's parliament building. Libya was torn apart yet again. This time, there were 3 core belligerents. The House of Representatives, backed by the Libyan National Army and the bulk of her other armed forces, the GNC and their loyalist militias, and the National Salvation Government, backed by LROR, among others. In 2015, the Islamic State joined the conflict, seizing territory around Sirte in February before releasing a video depicting the beheading of 21 Egyptian Coptic Christians the following week. Egypt's retaliatory strikes against ISIL positions in Libya following the harrowing loss of its citizens was not the only international response to the unfolding conflict, but it was probably the strongest. Sudan provided support and weapons to General Haftar and his LNA. Chad declared it had sent troops to Haftar, while Algeria allegedly occupied portions of Libyan territory along the border between the two countries. While many neighboring nations supported the House of Representatives and the LNA, the United Nations and the bulk of the international community did not. They backed the creation of a government of national accord and passed another resolution that threatened to seize assets and impose travel bans on key figures associated with the war. Despite the urging of some parties, such as Malta, the UN did not advocate another intervention. With the scars still raw from the last time and the bloody fallout still ongoing, this may have been seen as a step too far. War would ebb and flow for 6 years before a permanent ceasefire and the formation of a government of national unity brought it to an end in 2021. In the first year of the conflict, oil revenues fell by 90%, putting Libya's economy in jeopardy. The domestic strife made it possible for Islamic State to gain a foothold in the country, especially around Sirte, where they committed horrendous atrocities and laced vast areas of ground with landmines. In 2019, it was reported that malnutrition was rampant within the country, causing the deaths of many civilians, including large numbers of children. Citizens fleeing the carnage in their home country resulted in a refugee crisis across southern Europe and left thousands of people vulnerable to the exploitation and abuse Precious had faced between 2017 and 2019. As late as 2020, the UN reported large-scale shelling of civilian areas in Tripoli, resulting in high numbers of civilian casualties due to ongoing war crimes. In 2022, fighting resumed once again in Tripoli as the newly formed Government of National Stability took on the only slightly older Government of National Unity. Sporadic flashpoints continued throughout the year and into 2023. On September 10, 2023, 2 dams at Derna collapsed, leaving 4,702 people confirmed as dead and more than 8,000 missing. It has been alleged, but not confirmed, that military damage weakened the dams. At the very least, the dismal political and security situation contributed to some extent of the disaster in Derna. As of February 2024, Amnesty International was reporting that Libya's internal security agency continued to carry out enforced disappearance, arbitrary detention, and torture in the country. The collection of interlinked tragedies, dubbed the Libyan crisis, has not yet reached its end. There's no real conclusion to be reached here. There are those who believe that the 2011 protests and rebellion were the only correct courses of action, that Gaddafi's murderous regime had to be toppled, and that NATO was justified in the way it carried out its operation. There are others who believe the opposite. The events of 2011 and the end of the Gaddafi regime made the situation in Libya immeasurably worse, turning an optimistic and hopeful country into a lawless and fractured war zone. This video was never about coming down on one side or another. Scholars and historians could spend their entire careers trying to unravel this situation and still not arrive at a satisfying conclusion. Instead, what we set out to do was shed some light on just what occurred over these 8 months in 2011 and the seismic impression it has left on this part of the world and its people. Once upon a time, Libya was all over our news feeds. Since then, events in Syria, in Ukraine, in Gaza and Yemen and elsewhere have pushed it off the front pages and rendered it almost forgotten. And yet, the crisis is still not over, and the Libyan people continue to suffer in the wake of the 2011 revolution. Thanks for sticking with me on this one. It's not always been easy viewing. Remember to let us know what you think in the comments section below. What's your view on the Gaddafi regime, on NATO's actions, or on the Western intervention in general? What do you think lies in store for Libya? Do we have any Libyan viewers that can lend some personal accounts? We always love reading your comments, guys, and we wait them eagerly. But as always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new. Special thanks to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Play War Thunder for free using my link in the description or pinned comment. New players and those returning after 6 months get a massive bonus pack with multiple premium vehicles, 100,000 Silver Lions, the exclusive Eagle of Valor Decorator, and 7 days of premium access. This offer is available for a limited time only, so don't miss out.